Let's start with the topic that I have been long promising that I was going to do on the show, modern monetary theory. I talked about it a few weeks back when I was talking about how much money the United States could feasibly spend. I believe it was on infrastructure, but I did want to explain what modern monetary theory is from basic level. There are tons of books out on this. Obviously, I'm not the end-all be-all on it, but just kind of a starting point. What is it? How does it work? Why does it work? Why doesn't it cause inflation? Things like that. So to start, modern monetary theory has a couple of important prerequisites. So the first prerequisite is the country has to manage its own currency. So, for example, in the European Union, if they're a nation that uses the euro, individual countries don't manage the euro. They may manage their own spending of it, but they don't manage the euro. The euro is managed by the European Central Bank, which decides how many euros there are in circulation, and things like that. So the first requirement is a country has to manage its own currency. The second requirement is of modern monetary theory is that the country needs to not have its currency influenced by something else. So what this means is a country that's on the gold standard, for example, couldn't really do this, couldn't really use modern monetary theory, but a country whose sovereign power is the source of the value of its currency is eligible for modern monetary theory. So essentially what that means is, what I mean by that is, if a country, if the worth of a currency is dependent on the strength and trustworthiness and creditworthiness of a particular nation, then that nation is eligible for modern monetary theory. So those are really the only two requirements. Okay, so the way that modern monetary theory works, I think I'll just call it MMT. The way that MMT works is essentially you can spend at the governmental level unlimited amounts of money, and this is because each time that the government is appropriating an expenditure, or it's actively creating money. It's putting that money into the system. They don't have to wait. They're not taking from a bank account and saying, oh, we only have like $12 trillion, so I guess we can only spend, so many trillions of dollars because, whatever. To make sure that there's an even balance sheet. You don't need to do that. And by the way, this is very specific to national governments. So in the United States, state and local governments can't do this because the Constitution prohibits them from going into debt. So one of the other things, it's not really a requirement, but is kind of a requirement for this, for the sake of this argument, is that the country needs to be able, the sovereign entity that's using modern monetary theory needs to be able to go into debt. However, the real reason that states and municipalities are excluded is because they don't manage currency, right? They expend currency, they appropriate currency, but they don't manage currency, right? Only the federal government manages currency. So with that understanding in mind, essentially what modern monetary theory says is that as long as you manage your own currency, you can spend as much of that currency as you want without causing inflation. Now, this may raise some eyebrows, but how is that possible, right? You put so much money into the system, obviously the value of that currency declines. Well, so modern monetary theory has an answer for this, which is taxes. So it doesn't create a balance sheet necessarily, but what it says is you have to use taxes as a means to regulate the amount of currency flowing in the economy. You have to do it, taxes aren't, in this particular case, meant to be punitive or meant to be, indicative of a broader policy goal or implication. Essentially, the only thing is, if you have a graph of supply and demand, you need to just make sure that there is enough demand there needs to be enough demand for the money. And the way that you do that is you curtail supply. And the only way to curtail supply of money in a closed system is through the government taking it back, essentially making it disappear. And by the way, This is made easier because most currency nowadays is digital currency, right? Most of us don't walk around with thousands of dollars in our pocket. We may have a couple hundred in a bank account or whatever. We're not walking around with that much cash. So it's not actually about the physical number of dollar bills in the system, as it were. It's much modern monetary theory is made easier because most currency is digital, right? It's just ones and zeros in a bank account. It's important to us, obviously, but in terms of the grander economy, it is just numbers, right? In that easily can be moved around. Especially when governments make large appropriations, no one at the Federal Reserve or the Treasury is going in and counting $4 trillion out and handing them to whoever they're being handed to, right? It's being done in such a way that someone just types in a number and zoop, out it goes. So think about something that you think is worth $1. Let's say 4 gumballs. It's the best reference I could think of. Gumballs are 25 cents now. That's crazy. Anyway, so imagine a gumball, 25 cents. Now you got 4 of them. In your mind, that's worth $1, or whatever you want, right? Something at the dollar store, whatever. Something that's worth $1. Part of the reason that you believe it's worth $1 is because it's being sold to you as $1. Inflation is actually very psychological. It's more about how people feel than about the realities of the economy in a sense. If people believe that that 4 gumballs are worth $1, or whatever metaphor you want to use, $1 will continue to be worth 4 gumballs and vice versa, right? But when people start to feel like the money isn't worth anything, and by the way, this is mainly driven by the mercantile class, and this is the group of people who essentially buy and sell goods. So if you don't think the amount of money that you are spending to get whatever it is worth that, or vice versa, then you start to have problems with inflation. Prices can go up, right, if that dollar doesn't hold some value. Now remember, as I said earlier, the United States is not unique, but the United States currency is essentially, the value of it is essentially set by the creditworthiness of the US government. So the nice thing about MMT is that in order for inflation to happen, the nice thing about any monetary policy is that for inflation to happen, there needs to be a large scale reassessment of the value of $1, to the point like we had in Weimar, where people didn't believe that the marks were worth what they were worth, and government was reinforcing that policy by inflating the amount of currency in the system and things like that. And of course, if you read the history book, you can find stories about people bringing wheelbarrows of money in for a single loaf of bread, or burning money because it was cheaper than wood, and all sorts of things. But that kind of thing can't really happen under modern monetary theory, because of the way that the currency can be regulated to reduce the amount of supply to keep demand about the same. So if you imagine that the government wants to spend a huge amount of money. So during the presidential primaries, Bernie Sanders proposed what I think is a $16 trillion Green New Deal type infrastructure plan, which would do wonders for the country. Definitely need to go in that direction. But so the immediate question became, well, you're going to put $16 trillion into the U.S. economy. Will that cause inflation? And the answer was always no. And the reason for that was because, it'll be paid for in taxes. But that's actually not a correct way to think about it. Paid for means that we have an even balance sheet. That 16 trillion is going out, 16 trillion is coming in. But that's actually not the way that it would work under MMT. So 16 trillion, or whatever number you want to have going out, is going to go out. All that needs to happen on the other side is that government needs to collect enough money in order to make people feel psychologically in the country that there is not so much money in the system that it's no longer worth 4 gumballs, for example. So you actually don't have to do a ton of taxing to create a balance sheet increase. You just have to keep supply and demand, the intersection of supply and demand, somewhere around 4 gumballs, enough so that people don't start to question the value of money. And by someone question the value of money, I mean the mercantile class who's buying and selling goods, right? Prices of goods go up regularly, and people typically don't complain. Oftentimes, businesses will increase the price of things because things increase on their end, cost of living adjustments, yada yada, right? Prices typically tend to increase. But this doesn't break the system either. Even though the prices for things more or less increase across the board, the value is not moved enough in order to create panic in the markets by the mercantile class that there is going to be issues with how much a dollar is worth, or how much $1,000 is worth, or whatever it's going to be. So what's interesting is that the United States pretty much believes in modern monetary theory already. We just don't really do the balancing part on the other end. So if you think about how Congress works, so if you think about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the 2017 law that passed under Trump, we had a huge expenditure, not very popular. I think it was 17% popularity, I think. But it was just meant to, it was cut tax across the board. Now, there were lots of issues with the tax law, and it wasn't positive in the slightest, in my personal opinion. But it was essentially putting lots of money into the economy because the government was no longer collecting it, right? So the government said all this money that's currently in the system can stay in the system. We're not going to collect it and essentially make it go away. So the supply of money actually increased a lot. I think it was a couple $1 trillion. $4 or $5 trillion, I think it was. Don't quote me on that. But there was nothing on the demand side that changed significantly. People, we didn't have a ton of, we didn't have a panic in the markets. The same thing happened with the stimulus checks. Stimulus checks were a couple $1 trillion, and that didn't affect the dollar value either. So what these tend to show us is that we can continue to appropriate money more or less any way we want, and the threshold, the tolerance level that the economy has for that type of expenditure is very high, because in the last 4 or 5 years, we've passed, tens of trillions of dollars worth of relief, whether it's direct to consumers, like the 3 sets of stimulus checks, or whether it's direct to corporations, like the $4 trillion of quantitative easing that was done by the Federal Reserve in order to keep the stock market propped up at the beginning of the pandemic. So there's this huge, huge window of opportunity where we can pretty much spend wherever we want. Now, we do have to keep in mind about how much money is actually floating through the system, because eventually we will spend too much. We will get to a point where we're not collecting enough back to keep that supply and demand in check, where it will no longer be 4 gumballs for $1. But the amount of space we have before we get there is actually much larger than people originally believed. So with this, and if the Democratic Party or the leftists in Congress, progressives, whatever you want to call them, by the way, that excludes a huge number of Democrats who are corporate Democrats, bought and owned by corporations, yada yada. We don't count them. But like AOC, Ilhan Omar, and the like, and the Squad, and all of them, they should be pushing modern monetary theory, because the truth is, we already do it. A lot of the times, we don't need to pay for it. The question, how do you pay for it, is asinine in a system like ours, where we manage our own currency and when we have such a high tolerance for the amount of money that's in the system. Now, should we continue to tax people? Yeah, we should. One, because the way that modern monetary theory deals with inflation is by reducing the supply of money in the system, but also because in order to be meritocratic and to maintain our democratic status, we also need to be pulling money from the people who have the most money. Because money in this capitalist system, money is power, right? So you can buy influence with the amount of money that you have. So it's important that we maintain that some people cannot accumulate so much money that they can influence the system and they can have more than one vote. Specifically, this applies to billionaires. And I covered this on the show last week about how there should not be any billionaires. And this is more or less why. But we can actually do that. So Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, Bernie Sanders' wealth tax, taxes for the rich, taxes on, offshore investments, a leavers tax, the estate tax, things like that. We have the means to do it. And by the way, once we do that and we can bring the supply of money in the system down a little bit, we then open up so much more space that we can spend without causing real harm to the system. So I hope this has been a good breakdown of what modern monetary theory is, how it works, why it doesn't cause inflation, and why only some governments can implement it. If you need more information on modern monetary theory, there are lots of books out there. I suggest just a quick Google search and you can find them. And if you're in conversation with people who are governing at the national level, talk to them about modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory is going to open up the door for total nationalization of the healthcare industry, roads and bridges, huge amounts of infrastructure spending, a new deal, a Green New Deal, and also a federal jobs program. Fixing our broken immigration system, the amount of money that it needs, decarcerating, creating a decarceral system. All those things require money. Rebuilding our educational institutions, all those things require money. And the tolerance that we have for spending money can actually be much larger than it is now, and much larger than we are being told it is before we actually come up against inflation. We have the political power to do this. The question is, do we have the political will? And the way that we generate political will is we educate our lawmakers about modern monetary theory. We push for modern monetary theory to be adopted completely, even though there is some facets of our government that already believe in modern monetary theory as it is because of the way they act. We need to implement it as actual government policy and then make sure that we are constantly using that justification and waving away the stupid media question of how are you going to pay for it.